the sound of the sea is endless. A grey horizon breathing beneath a pale northern sky. Mist drifts over the marshes, where wooden boats rest like sleeping beasts, their sails whispering in the wind. This is where it began, a people born between land and tide, carried by hunger, faith, and the dream of something more. Before crowns, before England, before the name itself was ever spoken, there were the Saxons. Farmers turned warriors, pagans turned believers, wanderers who became the keepers of a kingdom. Their story is one of courage in the face of chaos, of love for land and kin, of survival across centuries of storm. Can you imagine standing on that ancient shore, the air cold against your skin, the salt on your tongue, knowing that one voyage could change the world forever? What would you take with you? Your courage, your faith, or your hope of home? And if you feel the pull of history, gently tap like and subscribe so you never miss a night's journey across the ages. Now dim your screen. Let the air grow still. And listen as the waves begin to whisper once more the story of the Saxons. Across the cold northern waters, the wind carried whispers of a people yet to be named. The sea was their mirror, their pathway, and sometimes their grave. Beneath skies veiled in fog, the ancestors of the Saxons lived by rhythm, the pull of the tide, the hunger of the seasons, the call of distant lands. In the dim dawns of the 5th century, the world was changing. To the south, the once mighty Roman Empire was fading like the last embers of a fire. Roads that had gleamed with chariots now cracked beneath weeds. Towns emptied. The order that had stretched across Europe for centuries was retreating into silence, and in that silence, the Saxons stirred. Their world lay far from the marble cities of Rome. It was a landscape of low hills, wind-bent forests, and cold estuaries that wound like silver veins through the earth. Here, wooden halls stood upon raised mounds, their thatched roofs glistening with dew. Smoke curled through the rafters, carrying the scent of peat and pine. Children played near the water's edge, where boats sat pulled up on the sand, curved sturdy vessels carved by hand, their ribs shaped from oak felled in the nearby woods. They were a people of tide and timber, these early Saxons. The sea was not their boundary, but their bridge. In narrow boats, they fished for herring and cod. They hunted seals and gathered mussels from the shallows. But they also watched the horizon, always the horizon, where strange clouds might be sails and the unknown might promise more. By the firelight of winter, the elders told stories of gods and giants, of wars that shaped the stars, of a time when all things were born from the yawning void. They spoke of Woden, the wise wanderer, one-eyed and cloaked in storm, of Thunor, the thunder-bringer, who guarded humankind, and of Tew, whose courage kept the order of the world. The flicker of flames made the runes on their carved posts seem to dance, and in the soft crackle of the fire the children listened with wide eyes. Sometimes in those long nights they heard the sea groaning against the shore, a sound that felt alive. "It speaks to us," the old ones would say. "It speaks of what is coming," and something was coming. To the west, across that restless sea, lay a land the Romans had once called Britannia, an island of mist and green, scattered with old stone roads and half-forgotten villas. The legions had withdrawn a generation before, leaving behind only fragments, broken walls, Latin prayers, and frightened people who no longer trusted that help would ever come again. They were vulnerable, and the Saxons, Jutes, and Angles, who shared the coasts of northern Europe, began to hear the rumours carried on the wind. It was said that the fields of Britain were rich, its rivers teeming with fish, its hills hiding iron and tin. Some said the Britons themselves had sent word across the sea, begging strong men to defend them from northern raiders called Picts and Scots. Others claimed that greed, not invitation, drove the Saxons to build their ships and set sail. Whatever the truth, one by one, small fleets began to leave the marshes and inlets of their homeland. The people watched as men and families packed what they could carry: tools, weapons, a few carved idols, and the woven banners of their kin. Mothers wrapped infants in furs and pressed their faces into their hair, breathing in the scent of home one last time. When the tide rose, they pushed their boats into the grey surf. Oars dipped. Wind filled the square sails. And slowly, the shore fell away, swallowed by mist and distance. Imagine that moment. The sound of creaking timbers, the cries of seabirds circling above, the salt spray on their faces. Behind them, the familiar forests faded. Ahead lay nothing but a world of cloud and possibility. The sea swelled and hissed beneath them, cold and immense. They did not yet know what waited across that water, only that something called to them. Days might pass without sight of land. The boats, small against the waves, pitched and groaned as they made their way westward. The people prayed to their gods, not for glory, but for safe passage. Some sang softly to keep their courage. Others gazed at the horizon, searching for a glimmer of green. And then, a cry. Land! Through the haze, cliffs appeared, dark, jagged, rising out of the sea like sleeping giants. Seabirds screamed overhead. The air changed, fresher, sweeter somehow, with the scent of wet earth and heather. They had reached the edge of Britain. The first landings were quiet. Small groups came ashore to explore the beaches, testing the ground beneath their feet. They found traces of life, the ruins of Roman watchtowers, stones still warm in the sun, and paths that led inland. There were settlements too, though many stood half deserted, their people scattered or hiding in the hills. For the Saxons, this new world must have felt both empty and alive. The forests were thick with oak and ash. Rivers wound through meadows where deer grazed. The soil, dark and rich, promised harvests beyond what their coastal homeland could offer. They built shelters first, simple huts of wattle and daub, ringed with stakes to guard against the unknown. Fires burned again, smoke rising like faint prayers to the gods who had carried them here. But the peace was fragile. Not all who came sought quiet settlement. Some were warriors, driven by hunger or ambition. Raids began, swift, brutal strikes along the coast. Villages burned. The Roman Britons, already weakened, could not hold every shore. Slowly, the newcomers claimed small footholds, then valleys, then entire regions. And yet, even as they fought, they changed. The land began to shape them. The damp air softened their speech. The wide plains altered their sense of space. Children born in Britain grew up hearing the cry of curlews instead of the roar of the North Sea. They were still Saxons, but also something new, something between the old world and the island that was becoming theirs. At night, they still told stories by the fire. But the tales began to shift. The gods of the homeland still walked among them, but now they wandered through British forests and across English fields. The sea no longer separated their past and future. It bound them, thread-like, to both. The Saxons were not alone in this. Other tribes, the Angles, the Jutes, the Frisians, followed their path. They came from across the northern coasts, each speaking tongues close enough to understand one another, each seeking land, safety, or destiny. Together, over generations, they would shape what would one day be called Anglo-Saxon England. But for now, in this first moment of arrival, the story was smaller. The quiet sound of waves on shingle, the flicker of a hearth in a strange land, the whisper of the wind through new trees. Somewhere, an old man traced runes on a piece of driftwood and cast it into the fire, giving thanks for the journey's end. A child, born on the crossing, slept in her mother's arms. Her first lullaby, the soft lap of waves against the shore. And above them all, the stars burned steady and indifferent, watching as one chapter of the ancient world faded, and another, humble, uncertain, yet enduring, began to rise. The Saxons had crossed the sea, their footprints pressed into British sand, and though they could not yet know it, the echo of those steps would shape the islands for centuries to come. The night deepens. The waves hush against the coast. In the dark, the whispering begins again, not of what was left behind, but of what will soon become home. Before the great migrations, before the sea journeys that carried them into legend, the Saxons were a people of quiet waters and shifting light. Their homeland stretched along the northern edge of the continent, a country of low plains and long estuaries where the land seemed to breathe with the tide. At dawn, mist rose from the marshes, silver and cool, wrapping the reeds in a soft veil. The air smelled of peat smoke and salt. From the doors of wooden halls, thin columns of smoke curled upward into the pale sky, marking the small communities scattered across the flatlands. These were not the grand cities of the Romans or the stone-built towns of the south. The Saxons' world was humbler, made of wood, earth, and water. Their villages clung to the edges of rivers, for the rivers were lifelines, highways through a landscape of bog and fen. Boats glided between settlements, carrying goods and gossip, fish and firewood, news of births and of battles. A Saxon child might learn to balance in a boat before learning to walk on dry land. The creak of oars, the sigh of the tide, and the calls of seabirds filled their days. Their homes were simple but strong, timber walls packed with clay, roofs of straw tied tight against the wind. Inside, a central hearth glowed. Around it, families gathered each evening, their faces lit by the flickering red light. The sound of spinning wheels, the scrape of knives shaping wood, and the low hum of conversation wove together in a rhythm older than memory. In these homes, life was built around kin. Family and tribe were everything. A person's worth lay not in wealth, but in loyalty. The Saxons had words for almost every kind of bond: brotherhood, oath friendship, kin duty, gift loyalty. Their world was bound by promises spoken aloud and sealed by handshakes before the fire. The land they lived on was not always kind. Winters were long and damp, the sky a low ceiling of grey. When storms rolled in from the North Sea, the wind howled through the gaps in the timber walls, and the waves beat hard against the inlets. Yet the Saxons endured. They fished through the ice, smoked their catch, and told stories through the dark months. When spring came, it arrived like a blessing. The air grew soft, the fields greened again, and the people turned to their fields. They were skilled farmers, tilling the soil with simple ploughs drawn by oxen, sowing barley, rye, and wheat in careful rows. Goats and sheep grazed on the higher ground, while pigs rooted through the forest edges for acorns. The people worked together, each knowing the rhythm of the seasons, each taking comfort in its return. But their days were not only labour and hunger. There was beauty too, in the sound of flutes carved from bone, in the shimmer of sunlight on wet grass, in the way firelight danced on polished amber beads worn by women at feast days. There were festivals marking the turning of the year, winter's end, the first harvest, the shortest night. At these times they sang songs that had no written words, songs carried through generations by memory alone. Imagine such an evening, a long table beneath the rafters, the smell of roasted meat and honeyed ale, the murmur of voices blending with the crackle of the hearth. The chieftain lifts his cup, carved from horn, and gives thanks for the land's bounty. Outside, frost gleams on the grass, and above the hall, the stars burn bright and unblinking. At the heart of these gatherings were the stories, the tales of gods and heroes, told in verses so old that no one remembered who first spoke them. A grey-bearded skald would rise, his voice carrying through the hall. Tales of creation and chaos, of mighty beings who walked the world before men, of courage and betrayal and the price of honour. In those stories lived Woden, the wanderer, who sought wisdom through sacrifice. Frigg, his wife, who saw fate in the threads she wove. And Thunor, who rode the storm clouds with his hammer flashing. The Saxons did not imagine their gods as distant. They were woven into the fabric of daily life. A fallen tree struck by lightning was a sign of Thunor's favour. A raven circling overhead, a message from Woden himself. Small shrines stood near the water's edge or beneath ancient trees. Little more than posts carved with faces, offerings of mead or bread left beneath them. The people spoke softly there, asking for good harvests, for health, for safe journeys. They believed the world around them was alive. Every river, every oak, every stone had its spirit. To live was to live among them, not above them. And so, the Saxons grew in quiet strength. They traded with neighbouring tribes, the Frisians, the Angles, the Jutes, exchanging amber for salt, cloth for iron. They shared not only goods, but words, shaping a family of tongues that would one day become the English language. Theirs was not a written world, but an oral one. Knowledge passed from mouth to ear, from parent to child, from elder to youth. Still, whispers from beyond the horizon reached their shores. Traders spoke of lands across the Western Sea, of the island of Britannia, where the Roman lords had once ruled. They told of towns now abandoned, of farmlands left untended, of fortresses with empty gates. To a people used to hardship, it sounded almost like a dream. But in these early generations, most were content to remain. Their roots ran deep in the soil of the north. They built their halls on the same sites as their ancestors, their graves marked by mounds rising gently against the skyline. The dead were buried with care, men with their spears and shields, women with their brooches and weaving tools, children with tiny gifts to guide them into the next world. On still evenings, when the sun sank low over the marshes, the people would gather at these burial places. They believed the spirits of the ancestors lingered close, watching, listening, guarding their kin. A soft wind might move through the reeds. and the living would murmur greetings to those who had gone before. Can you imagine walking there at dusk? The light fading, the air cool, the land so flat you could see the line where sky met earth. Somewhere, a dog barks. A heron lifts from the water, its wings wide and slow. The smell of wood smoke drifts from a distant hall. This was the Saxon world before the sea crossing, not yet restless, but already dreaming. Over time, small changes began to stir. Populations grew. The best land near the rivers became crowded. Younger sons, with no farms to inherit, looked outward. Warriors tested their strength in raids against rival tribes. Some returned with stories of richer fields across the sea, and each story, told and retold beside the fire, carried a spark of longing. The sea that had once felt like a wall began to seem like a road. Mothers mended sails, while men shaped new boats, longer, sleeker, built to ride the open waters. Children ran their fingers along the carved dragon heads at the prows, eyes wide with wonder and fear. The old men watched in silence, remembering the tales of the gods who had once crossed the heavens on storms. Not everyone wished to leave. The land was still home, the graves of ancestors, the groves where offerings were made, the fields that had fed generations. But change has a way of calling softly at first, then louder, until it becomes a song one cannot ignore. And so, the idea of departure took root, at first only as a story, then as a plan whispered between families, then as a fleet waiting at the water's edge. But in these final quiet years before the Great Migration, life still went on as it always had. Children learned the shapes of runes scratched into driftwood. Women wove cloth the colour of the sky. Men mended fences and told tales of courage. In the evenings, smoke rose from the hearths, and songs drifted over the reeds. They were still, at heart, children of the Shorelands, people who listened to the wind and watched the water, who believed that both the land and the sea spoke to them, if only one stood still long enough to hear. The sun would soon set on this familiar world. A new horizon waited, across waters cold and uncertain. But for one last breath of time, the Saxons lived in peace among the rivers and the marshes, their lives steady as the tide. Somewhere, a gull cried above the water, the reeds bent with the breeze, and in that whispering sound, the sea's song began again, the same soft call that would one day lead them westward, toward destiny, and toward the island that would make their name eternal. The morning tide was high, and the world lay beneath a sky of pewter grey. On the marshy edges of the northern coast, the Saxons gathered, men, women, and children standing beside the boats that would soon bear them away. The air was thick with mist and the low hum of voices. A gull wheeled overhead, its cry sharp and lonely. No one spoke loudly. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. For in that moment, between land and sea, the people knew they were crossing not just water, but the threshold between what had been and what was yet to come. The boats stood ready. Their hulls were curved and narrow, carved from oak, their planks sealed with pitch. Strips of animal hide were bound around the seams, and along each side, the iron nails glinted like tiny stars. At the prow of every ship, a carved head, wolf, serpent, or dragon, faced the sea, meant to ward off spirits that might lurk beneath the waves. The chieftains walked among their people, offering quiet words, touching shoulders, sharing looks that carried both pride and sorrow. Each family brought what they could: sacks of grain, tools, furs, carved idols of their gods. Children clung to their mothers' cloaks, eyes wide with a mix of wonder and fear. Somewhere, a dog barked, the sound echoing strangely across the still water. As the tide began to turn, the first boats were pushed into the shallows. The oars dipped, breaking the surface with a soft rhythm. Voices called out in low unison, not shouts, but the kind of chant that keeps courage steady. One by one, the ships glided away from the mudflats, their sails catching what little wind the morning offered. The shore grew smaller, the mist thickened, and the sound of home, the creak of carts, the call of herons, the laughter of children left behind, faded into the hush of the sea. For days, the world was nothing but water and sky. The Saxons were no strangers to the sea, yet the open ocean was another kind of power entirely. Waves rose and fell like the breathing of some vast creature. The air was raw, tasting of salt and iron. The sails snapped and groaned above them. By day the horizon stretched endless and pale. By night it disappeared completely, and only the stars guided their way. Men watched the constellations they had known since childhood, the wain, the swan, the hunter, and steered by their slow movement across the heavens. The boats travelled together in small fleets. They kept close so that no ship would be lost to the fog. Sometimes when the wind died, they rowed. Long, even strokes that set the muscles of their arms aching. At other times, storms rose sudden and fierce, drenching them in rain so cold it burned. Still, they pressed on. The Saxons had always trusted the sea, even when it tested them. The old song said that Woden himself had once wandered the waves, and that Thunor guarded those who dared to cross them. So they whispered prayers into the wind, short, practical words of gratitude and hope. Between the hardships, there were moments of quiet beauty. The water shimmered beneath the sun, silver and gold. Seals surfaced, curious, their dark eyes gleaming. At dusk, the horizon would glow with a strange, soft light, the sky the colour of burnished copper. Families huddled together under firs, telling stories to keep their spirits warm. "Tell me again," a child might whisper, "what it looks like, the new land." And someone, staring out into the fog, would answer softly, "They say it is green, greener than our fields. They say the rivers are wide and full of fish, and that the soil is dark, rich as night itself." The sea carried these hopes like small flames in the vastness of its breath. At times, the fog grew so thick that the boats vanished from each other's sight. Voices echoed strange and far away. Men called to their companions and heard only the sea's reply. In those moments, the travellers felt the old presence of the deep, that ancient fear of being lost between worlds. But even the fog was not endless. One morning, as the wind shifted, the mist began to thin. The first to notice were the birds, small dark shapes circling above the waves, crying out in sharp tones. Then faintly, a new smell reached them: wet grass, earth, and something sweet. "Land," someone murmured. The words spread from boat to boat like a heartbeat. Men leaned forward, eyes strained against the haze. And slowly, out of the greyness, a darker line appeared. Cliffs rising from the sea, their tops wrapped in cloud. The people fell silent. Even the oars paused. It was not joy they felt first, but awe, the deep, still awe that comes when dream becomes reality. For this was Britannia, the fabled Isle of the West, the place they had only heard of in fireside tales. The cliffs loomed higher as they approached, streaked with shadow and light. Waves broke white against their base. The air grew sharp, filled with the scent of wet stone and heather. They found a place where the land curved inward, a sheltered bay where the sea softened and the beach lay open and pale. The first ship grounded gently on the sand. The others followed. One by one, the travellers stepped ashore, their feet sinking into the wet earth. Some knelt and pressed their palms to the ground. Others looked back at the horizon, where their homeland now lay invisible beyond the mist. No trumpets greeted them. No banners marked the place. Only the sound of the wind moving through the grass and the rhythmic hiss of waves behind them. They built small camps near the shore, rings of huts and fires that smoked against the low sky. The wood was strange, the soil different beneath their hands. At night, the mist rolled down from the hills, soft as breath, and the newcomers huddled close for warmth. The islands seemed quiet, almost empty, but they soon found signs of others. Old Roman roads still straight beneath the weeds, crumbling stone walls half buried in moss, fragments of pottery gleaming in the dirt. Here and there distant figures watched from the trees, the Britons, the island's old inhabitants, wary and silent. At first there was no battle, only curiosity. Some traded small goods, salt for hides, tools for food. But beneath the cautious peace, something restless stirred. The Saxons, for all their weariness, saw how fertile the land was. They saw the empty villas, the broken farms, the fields ready for ploughing. And in the long nights by the fire, when the sea's voice faded and the stars stood cold and high, they began to dream of staying. The sea had carried them far. It had tested and spared them, and now it seemed it had delivered them not to an end, but to a beginning. Days turned into weeks. More ships arrived, drawn by the stories carried back on the waves. Small encampments became villages. Timber halls rose once more, built in the old style but on new soil. Children's laughter echoed among the hills where Roman voices had long fallen silent. Yet even as they built, they remained haunted by the sea. Each night they could hear it sighing in the distance, a reminder of where they had come from and what they had left behind. They called their new settlements after their old ones, names carried like seeds across the water. Places like Sussex, Essex, and Wessex, meaning the South, East, and West Saxons. In those names, they kept the memory of their origins alive. The Saxons did not yet think of themselves as conquerors. They were settlers, wanderers, families seeking soil and sky. But time would change that. As more ships came and the lands filled, their presence would no longer be quiet. The soft beginnings would harden into borders, and the horizon would once again fill with sails. This time not of journey, but of war. For now, though, peace held, fragile, pale as the morning light. The sea mist lingered along the shore, moving like breath over the sand. In the distance, the hills rolled green beneath a drifting sun. A child born on this new land toddled near the edge of the camp, her small footprints marking the sand. She would never see the coast of her ancestors, never hear the gulls of the old homeland. For her, this place, with its rain and its quiet and its wide, empty skies, would be the only home she knew. Somewhere behind her, a man mended a sail, though he no longer planned to leave. A woman stirred a pot over the fire, humming an old song. and from the cliffs above, the wind carried the mingled scents of sea and soil, as though the world itself was learning to breathe anew. The Saxons had crossed into the fog and found not the edge of the world, but another beginning. In years to come, poets would tell of these first crossings, how brave men defied the sea, how the gods guided their sails. But the truth was quieter. It was the courage of ordinary hands, rowing through endless mist. It was the hope of mothers who whispered to their children that the dawn would come soon. And it did come, slowly, gently, through the lifting fog. The island waited, silent and green, ready to change them as much as they would change it. The sea's song faded behind them, but its rhythm lived on, pulsing softly in their blood. They were no longer just children of the Shorelands. They were voyagers, carriers of fire and language and dream. And before the century was done, the misted isle they had reached would no longer belong only to legend. It would begin to bear their name. The first Saxon fires rose along the British coast like faint constellations of orange light. Seen from the cliffs, they flickered against the mist, marking small, uncertain settlements, the beginnings of a people learning to breathe in a new world. By day, smoke curled into the sky, thin and pale. By night, it glowed softly across the dunes, its warmth barely reaching the wide, empty darkness beyond. Britain, when the Saxons arrived, was a land half dreaming. The old order had slipped away like sand through fingers. The Roman legions, the iron heart of empire, had departed more than a generation before, leaving behind a landscape scattered with ghosts. Broken villas, weed-choked roads, and the faint echo of Latin prayers drifting through ruined chapels. Nature was reclaiming what men had built. Ivy crept over the marble faces of forgotten gods. Roofs sagged. Birds nested in the crumbling towers. And through those ruins walked the island's remaining people, weary farmers, scattered tribes, and chieftains clinging to fragments of the world Rome had promised but could no longer protect. The Saxons, stepping ashore, found themselves in a land both old and strangely new, a place of stone and silence where every wind seemed to carry a story. They did not come all at once, nor under a single banner. Some arrived as warriors, others as families, others still as refugees from hunger. They landed wherever the sea allowed, along the southern shores, the eastern marshes, the river mouths that opened like veins into the island's green heart. At first they built quietly, small wooden halls ringed with ditches and stakes. They cleared forests, burned the stubble, sowed barley in the black soil. They named their new homes after the rivers, the hills, the gods who had followed them across the water. But the land was not empty. From the misty hills and forested valleys, the Britons watched. The descendants of Celts and Romans, speaking their own old tongue, wearing crosses on their necks. Some traded with the newcomers, others resisted. Skirmishes flared like sparks, brief and brutal, fading as quickly as they began. For a time, the two peoples existed side by side, not in harmony, but in uneasy balance. The Saxons brought new ways of living, communal halls, long feasts, the songs of their ancestors. The Britons held to stone churches, to priests who still muttered Latin liturgy over half-forgotten graves. Imagine the sound of those worlds touching. The ring of a Saxon axe echoing through an abandoned Roman courtyard. the chant of a monk blending with the creak of a pagan oar-boat pulling into shore. It was not peace, but it was the beginning of something neither side yet understood. The Saxons found the island rich but strange. Its weather shifted quickly, sunshine turning to rain in the span of a single breath. Forests stretched for miles, tangled and ancient. Streams ran clear and cold, filled with trout and eel. The hills were dotted with old stone rings, the remnants of people who had lived there long before either Roman or Saxon. To the newcomers, these monuments felt sacred. They avoided them at first, whispering that the stones held spirits, or watched silently through the fog. But curiosity always returns. Children played among them, running fingers over the carvings, and soon the old fear softened into quiet reverence. The Saxons were builders, but not of stone. They trusted wood, living, breathing, familiar. So they raised halls of timber, carved from the forests they cleared. Each was the heart of a settlement, its roof high, its doors wide, its hearth ever burning. Inside, the chieftain sat with his kin, surrounded by warmth and shadow. Feasts were held to mark the harvest, the birth of a child, or the end of a voyage. There, beneath the smoky rafters, stories of the homeland were told again. But now the endings were different. The gods still walked among them, but they walked new paths. Woden wandering the misty downs, Thunor's hammer echoing through English thunder. Over time, the Saxons' words began to change, shaped by the island's air and the mingling of tongues. The way they spoke, the way they named the world, slowly bent towards something new. The first fragile roots of the English language taking hold in the fertile ground of Britain. But the peace did not last forever. As the settlements grew, hunger for land deepened. The best valleys, the richest fields, all became prizes worth fighting for. Small clashes grew into battles. Wooden shields, painted and bound with rawhide, clashed beneath the grey skies. Spears shattered. Smoke rose again, this time not from hearths, but from burning halls. To the Britons, these newcomers were invaders, wild men from beyond the sea, tearing apart what little remained of Rome's promise. To the Saxons, they were defenders of a world already dying, clinging to the old while the new demanded space. And so, year by year, the Saxons pushed further inland. They did not march like armies, but flowed like water, filling the gaps, following the rivers, building as they conquered. When one tribe fell, another settlement followed, until the southern lands spoke with Saxon voices and sang Saxon songs. Still, not all was war. Between the fighting came trade, marriages, small gestures of peace. The island's story was not written only in battle, but also in the quiet joining of lives. In some places, Roman walls still stood. The Saxons walked their length, wondering at the smooth stones, the carved patterns, the roads that ran straight and true across the land. Though they did not build such things themselves, they learned from what remained. Old materials found new purpose. A Roman column repurposed as a Saxon threshold, a mosaic tile crushed into lime for mortar. The island was being reborn, not through destruction, but transformation. At dusk, the settlements glowed softly, their smoke rising into the cool air. The sounds of the day faded, axes, laughter, hammers, replaced by the hum of voices in the halls. Children listened to tales of the crossing, already half legend. The sea, in memory, had become larger, the storms fiercer, the gods more vivid. The first settlers were heroes now, their names woven into song. And outside, in the wide darkness, the land itself seemed to listen, hills and fields absorbing the rhythm of a new people's heartbeat. For all their differences, the Saxons and Britons shared something deeper. They both belonged to the earth. Each generation buried its dead beneath mounds of grass, planted crops above old graves, and whispered prayers, whether to Christ or to Woden, for the same gifts: safety, rain, good harvests, peace. And sometimes, when the fog was thick and the bells of an old church drifted faintly across the fields, it was hard to tell which world was which, the old or the new, the Roman or the Saxon, the pagan or the Christian. They were becoming, slowly, a single island again. Yet for all its quiet beauty, this time was fragile. The Saxons did not yet rule, they only endured. Across the channel, new tribes stirred, and even greater storms were waiting to break upon these shores. But that was still to come. For now, in this in-between age, half smoke, half stone, the Saxons learned to call this land home. They planted their first great fields, built their first true halls, and began to weave their stories into Britain's soil. The mist rolled over the hills at night, soft as wool, wrapping village and ruin alike. The fires burned low. Somewhere, a lone bell tolled from an old Roman church, its sound drifting out across the sleeping valleys. The Saxons listened, perhaps not understanding the words it once called men to pray with, but hearing, in its slow echo, something familiar, a rhythm, a promise, a heartbeat in the dark, and in that sound, in the mingled smoke of hearth and ruin, the island began to remember its new name. The age of the Saxons had truly begun. The dawn that rose over Britain in the 6th century was pale and slow, like a hesitant breath after a long sleep. The wars had quieted for a time. The fires of conquest dimmed to embers, and from those embers, new shapes began to form. Small kingdoms rising like islands from the sea of the old world's ruins. The Saxons had come as wanderers, as families seeking land and life. But now, their children and grandchildren were settlers no longer. They were lords and farmers, warriors and wise women, builders of halls and keepers of new laws. They looked upon the fields of Britain, once Roman, once Celtic, and saw them not as strange soil, but as home. Their wooden halls dotted the hills, their smoke curling into skies that no longer smelled foreign. Sheep grazed on meadows once patrolled by Roman legions. Forests that had been wild for centuries now echoed with the ring of axes and the laughter of children. The Saxons had not simply arrived, they had taken root. Across the island, power gathered in pockets, each centered on a strong leader. A king or king, chosen for courage and wisdom as much as for blood. Some ruled no more than a valley or two, others the wide plains where rivers wound like silver threads. In time, their borders grew, their banners multiplied, and the land began to whisper new names: Kent, Sussex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex. 7 kingdoms, the heptarchy as later ages would call them, though their edges shifted like waves upon a shore. They were not yet a single people, but they shared a spirit, the rhythm of the Saxon tongue, the faith of their ancestors, the deep love of land and kin. Each kingdom had its own heart, its own story. Kent, the gate of the south. It was in Kent that the first true Saxon crown was set upon a head. From the shores where the earliest settlers had landed came the kings of Kent, proud and shrewd, whose rule stretched inland toward London. Their ships traded across the Channel with the Franks. Their halls were filled with fine cloth, glass beads, and wine from distant Gaul. Kent was the doorway between worlds, between the pagan north and the Christian south, between Britain's rugged heart and the soft winds of the continent. Here, in time, the first missionaries would come, bearing the cross and the written word. But for now, Kent was a kingdom of hearth and harbour, of boats drawn up on the beach, and of feasts that echoed long into the night. Sussex and Essex, the sons of the shore. To the west and east stretched the other shorelands, Sussex, the realm of the South Saxons, and Essex, the land of the East Saxons. Their people lived close to the sea, their voices carrying the rhythm of the tide. They were sailors and hunters, men who knew the marsh and the estuary, who built low wooden churches beside the water, and whose gods still watched from oak groves and hilltops. Their kings ruled not through vast armies, but through kinship, gathering their warriors beneath banners embroidered by their wives, oaths sealed by mead and memory. East Anglia, the fields between rivers. Further north lay East Anglia, a kingdom of wide skies and gentle plains. Its two peoples, the North folk and South folk, were bound by the rivers that wound through their land, their settlements marked by windmills and burial mounds rising softly against the horizon. East Anglia was a place of quiet strength. Its people farmed well, traded widely, and buried their dead with care and ceremony. In time, its kings would lie beneath great ship-shaped graves, surrounded by treasures that gleamed in the dark, gold brooches, jewelled swords, and silver bowls, signs of both faith and farewell. Mercia, the heart of the island. To the west rose Mercia, the kingdom of the borderlands, the mark between the Saxons and the still free Britons. It was a land of rivers and rolling hills, of deep forests where wolves still roamed. Mercia's kings were builders and diplomats, as well as warriors. They stretched their reach across the Midlands, forging alliances through marriage and gift-giving. Mercia became the island's beating heart, neither wholly north nor south, neither old nor new, but something in between. Its people were known for their craftsmanship, the carving of bone and wood, the weaving of fine cloth, the working of bronze and silver into delicate forms. In their hands, the raw materials of the island became art, and from their halls, the idea of England began to stir. Northumbria, the realm of the rising wind. And then, far to the north, where the land climbed toward the cold and the sea roared against jagged cliffs, lay Northumbria, the realm beyond the Humber River. Here, the Saxons met a harsher beauty. The winters were long and biting, the moors vast and empty. But from that loneliness came strength. The Northumbrians built monasteries on the wild coast, where monks wrote by candlelight while storms beat against the walls. They raised kings whose names would echo through centuries, warriors and scholars both, rulers of a land both fierce and holy. In later days, Northumbria would shine like a lantern in the dark, sending light across the island and beyond. Wessex, the dream of the West, and finally, in the soft hills and river valleys of the southwest, there grew Wessex, the land of the West Saxons. At first, small and quiet, Wessex would in time rise to greatness, gathering the scattered threads of the island into one woven whole. Its people were stubborn and steadfast, their kings patient and cunning. They farmed the richest soil, built strong halls, and learned the value of endurance. In Wessex, the seeds of unity were planted, though few could yet imagine how far those roots would grow. Through these 7 kingdoms, the Saxon world unfolded, not as a single empire, but as a living, breathing patchwork. Each had its moments of triumph, its kings who ruled in glory, and its nights of ruin when fire swept through its halls. The island was alive again, restless, growing, divided, but vibrant. And amid that vitality, something began to shift. For the first time, people started to think not only of tribe and kin, but of something larger, of Englerland, the land of the Angles and Saxons together. The word itself carried the sound of belonging, of the island slowly shaping its name. Life in these kingdoms was both simple and rich. At sunrise, smoke rose from every hearth. Men went to the fields, women to the looms. Children fetched water from streams that glittered in the early light. At dusk, they gathered in the hall to eat, to sing, to listen. The songs told of heroes long dead, Beowulf, Sigurd, and others whose courage outlived their bones. But there were new stories too, of kings who ruled the valleys and warriors who guarded the borders, of queens whose wisdom kept peace when swords could not. The Saxons loved stories. They believed that to speak a name was to give it life, and so their poets, their scops, kept the past alive with every word they sang. In the glow of the hearth, a boy might listen and dream of the day he too would wear a sword. A girl might trace the patterns of the woven cloth beside her and imagine the feasts she would host, the guests she would greet. It was an age of beginnings, rough-edged and uncertain, but full of breath and promise. Yet beneath the peace, the old gods still walked. In sacred groves, sacrifices were made to Thunor and Tiw. On hilltops, fires burned for Woden, the All-Father. The Saxons lived between worlds, one foot in the pagan past, one edging toward a future that would soon bring a new faith across the sea. The old and the new existed side by side. The cross not yet triumphant, the hammer not yet forgotten. For now, the gods of the Saxons watched in silence as the 7 kingdoms stirred, stretched, and began to dream of power. At night, the island lay in peace. From the north to the south, fires burned gently in the halls. Wolves called from the woods, and owls drifted over fields of stubble. The moonlight fell across the rivers like threads of silver, binding the kingdoms in its soft glow. Somewhere, a king knelt beside a small fire, tracing lines in the dirt, marking borders, shaping dreams. He could not know that centuries later, those lines would harden into nations, and that the stories of his people would become the stories of a world. For now, he was only a man. Tired, hopeful, wrapped in furs, the crackle of fire the only sound in the dark. And across the still land, the 7 kingdoms slept, not in silence, but in waiting. The dawn of England was still far away, but already, in the hush between owl and sunrise, it could almost be heard, a heartbeat in the mist, steady and growing. Before the bells of the new faith rang across England, the Saxons lived beneath an older sky, a sky filled with gods, spirits, and signs. To them, the world itself was sacred. Every storm, every stone, every shadowed grove whispered of powers unseen but deeply felt. They did not build great temples of marble or gold. Their worship was quieter, woven into the rhythm of life itself. It took place beneath oak and ash, in meadows where rivers curved like silver serpents, or upon the wind-swept hills where the horizon stretched without end. At dawn, when the first light touched the land, farmers would pause before taking up their tools. They would raise their eyes to the east and murmur a few words, not written, never memorized, but born from gratitude for the warmth, the crops, the breath in their lungs. In their hearts, they knew the gods were listening. Of all these deities, Woden was the greatest, the wanderer, the wise one, the god of battle and poetry. He was both king and seeker, both giver and taker. The Saxons saw him not as distant, but near, moving through the mist in the form of an old man, one eye hidden, his cloak trailing in the wind. They said Woden had hung 9 nights upon the world tree, pierced by his own spear, seeking the secret of the runes, the magic of meaning itself. Through his sacrifice came knowledge, and through knowledge, power. His name carried weight in every hall. Before great decisions or dangerous journeys, men would swear oaths by Woden's honour, believing that to break such a vow invited ruin. Warriors carved his symbol into their shields. Chieftains whispered his name before battle, hoping for his favour. But Woden was not alone. The Saxon pantheon was a family of forces, each holding its place in the delicate order of the world. Thunor, the thunderer, wielded his mighty hammer. His storms rolled across the land like drums, his lightning splitting trees and hearts alike. Yet his fury was not feared. It was cherished, for his rain fed the fields, his thunder drove away spirits of blight. On hilltops, the people raised small altars of stone where they left offerings of bread and ale, praying for good harvests and protection. Tiw, god of justice and courage, was honoured by warriors and judges alike. His was the day of oaths, the guardian of fairness in battle and in speech. Men invoked his name when seeking truth, for Tiw's own hand had been lost in the binding of a great wolf. A sacrifice for the safety of all. Frigg, the queen of heaven, wove the threads of fate. Women whispered her name during childbirth, trusting her calm wisdom. They said she saw the future, but spoke of it rarely, for even the gods could not escape the weave of destiny. And then there was Eostra, the goddess of spring, the bringer of dawn, renewal, and soft light. Her festival came with the turning of the seasons, when the long dark of winter gave way to warmth and blossom. Fires were lit on hilltops, and garlands of flowers were woven by young hands. From her name, centuries later, a new word would bloom, Easter, carrying a memory of the old within the new. The Saxons believed the world was bound together by unseen threads, the living, the dead, and the divine, intertwined like roots beneath the soil. When a child was born, the family placed a carved charm above the cradle to guard against wandering spirits. When a man died, his kin lit a great pyre or raised a mound of earth, believing that the soul would travel through mist and shadow to the other world, a realm of feasting and peace for the brave, or of quiet rest beneath Woden's watchful eye. They called it simply the beyond. Death did not end belonging, it deepened it. The ancestors were never far. Offerings of bread or milk were sometimes left at the edge of fields, not as fear, but as gratitude. Small gifts to those who had walked before, whose spirits might bless the crops or guard the home. In their world, omens mattered. A flight of ravens across the dawn sky might mean Woden's favour, a sudden stillness before a storm could speak of Thunor's warning. The cries of owls, the turning of smoke, the fall of a leaf. All were messages, if one had the patience to listen. Wise men, known as seers, interpreted these signs. They would cast lots made of carved wood or bone, or mark patterns in the ashes of the hearth. Women skilled in herbs and charms, the lees, tended to both body and spirit, mixing medicine with prayer. In later ages, some would call them witches, but in their time they were respected, even revered. To the Saxons, the unseen was not separate from the seen. The divine was the fabric of life itself, not something beyond it. When storms rolled in from the west, they did not curse the gods, they listened. When sickness came, they didn't despair. They sought meaning. In every shadow, they sensed presence. In every silence, they felt possibility. Their festivals followed the cycle of the year, a turning circle of dark and light. In midwinter, they gathered for Yule, the feast of fire and endurance. Great logs burned in the hall for 12 nights, each spark a promise that the sun would return. They sang, feasted, and gave gifts, not only to each other, but to the spirits of hearth and field. Evergreens were brought indoors, symbols of life that did not wither, even in the coldest months. When spring returned, they honoured Eostre, painting eggs, dancing through fields newly green. In summer came the blots, the offerings, of food, of ale, of gratitude. The year's first harvest was shared with the gods, the people raising their cups to the sun and to the soil. And when autumn returned, they lit fires once more, not for warmth, but for remembrance. The ancestors' names were spoken aloud, the old songs sung softly by the firelight. The cycle turned, and the people with it. In the Saxon imagination, the universe was held together by the world tree, Irminsul, the great pillar that bound heaven, earth, and underworld. Its roots drank from the waters of wisdom, its branches brushed the realm of the gods. Some say the Saxons built wooden poles in its honour, carved with runes and crowned with antlers or bird wings. To stand before such a pillar was to feel the spine of the world beneath one's feet, to know that all life was part of a vast, unbroken design. This vision of the world gave them courage. When battle came, they fought not merely for land or king, but for their place in the eternal order, under the eyes of gods who knew both victory and loss. When storms destroyed the harvest, they rebuilt, trusting the cycle to return. Their faith was not about certainty, it was about rhythm, the slow, steady breathing of the world, the balance between life and death, day and night, sea and shore. And yet, even as these beliefs bound them, winds of change began to stir. Across the sea, in the lands of the Franks and the Gauls, a new faith was spreading, one that spoke of a single God, of forgiveness, of light eternal. Traders and travellers carried tales of it to the Saxon shores. Some listened with curiosity, others turned away. But change, once begun, is like the tide, patient, persistent, inevitable. In the coming generations, monks would cross the same waters the Saxons once had, bearing not swords, but words. They would build churches where oak trees once stood, ring bells where ravens once called. And yet, even when the cross rose high above their halls, the Saxons would never fully lose the whisper of the old world. In their stories, in their sayings, in their love of land and sky, the echo of Woden's wisdom and Thunor's thunder would linger, quiet, steady, alive. Tonight, if you listen to the wind through the trees, you might still hear it. That ancient rhythm, that breath between worlds. It is the song of a people who lived close to the earth, who found meaning in every rustle of leaf, every flicker of flame. The Saxons stood under the banner of Woden once, beneath skies both merciful and wild. And though the world has turned 1,000 times since then, the same stars still shine above. The same wind still moves through the fields they once called home. The gods have changed, but the wonder remains. The sea had carried many things to the Saxon shores. Traders, storms, stories, dreams. But one morning, long after the old gods had claimed their sacred groves and the runes had been carved deep into the hearts of men, the waves brought something new. It came not with thunder or conquest, but with quiet footsteps and the sound of bells. Across the water from Gaul, small wooden boats approached the southern coast of Kent. Within them were men in simple robes, their faces pale with salt and wind, their hands clasping crosses made of wood. They carried no swords, no banners, only words, words of mercy, hope, and eternal light. The year, it is said, was 597, and at their head stood a man named Augustine. He was not the first to speak of the new faith in these lands. Whispers of the Christian God had long travelled among the Saxons, through traders from the Frankish kingdoms, through slaves taken in raids, through half-remembered fragments of Roman prayer. But Augustine's coming was different. He did not pass through. He came to stay. His mission had begun in Rome under the blessing of Pope Gregory the Great, a man who had once seen fair-haired Saxon children sold in the markets of the city, and moved by pity had declared, "They are not Angles but angels if only they knew the light." And so Gregory sent Augustine north, across seas and doubts, to bring that light to the misted island where the old gods still ruled. The journey was long and uncertain. Augustine hesitated many times, fearing the strangeness of the land and the fierceness of its people. Yet he came, carrying faith like a fragile flame through the fog. When at last he reached Thanet, an island off the Kentish coast, he was met by King Ethelbert, ruler of Kent, a cautious, curious man whose queen, Bertha, was already Christian, the daughter of a Frankish king. Ethelbert agreed to meet these strangers in the open air, wary of their power, but intrigued by their peace. Beneath a clear sky, amid the wind's whisper through the grass, Augustine and his followers sang hymns in Latin. The king listened in silence. No sword was raised, no threat was made. When the chanting ceased, Ethelbert spoke simply. "Your words are fair," he said, "and your promises bright. I will not harm you. Dwell among us. Preach as you will." And so, on that quiet day in Kent, the story of the Saxons began to turn. Augustine and his monks built their first church not far from the sea, a simple wooden structure on the site where Canterbury now stands. They lit candles, sang softly, and prayed for the land that surrounded them. Slowly people began to come. Some were drawn by curiosity, others by kindness, others still by the strange peace that seemed to fill the air around the monks. They spoke of a God who was not bound to the forest or the sky, but who had shaped both, a God who saw all, forgave all, and loved all. For a people who had lived so long by the rhythm of fate, it was a startling thought. That destiny could be more than the weaving of unseen threads, that mercy could outweigh strength. In time, King Ethelbert himself converted. On a summer's day, he was baptized in the waters near his hall, the sunlight glinting on the river's surface as the monks sang their hymns. With the king's faith came the faith of his people. Churches rose where oak groves once stood. The smoke of sacrifice gave way to the scent of incense. The wooden cross replaced the carved totem. But the change was not sudden. It never truly is. For a while, the old gods and the new walked side by side. A man might still whisper Woden's name before a hunt, then kneel at Mass on Sunday. The feasts of the year still followed the turning seasons, though now the prayers were different. Even the festivals changed only in name. Yule became Christmas, though the fires still burned and the evergreens still hung above the hearth. Eostra's spring rites became Easter, though eggs and flowers still carried their meaning of life renewed. The monks did not erase the Saxons' world. They wove their gospel into it, thread by thread. They spoke in gentle tones, teaching letters and writing, teaching that the same runes that once marked oaths could now record holy words. They told of a world beyond death, not a shadowed hall or a feast of heroes, but a paradise of peace. For those who had lost sons to war, daughters to sickness, or crops to the storm, this promise was balm. The change spread slowly north and west. From Kent to Essex, then to Northumbria, where kings and queens would one day turn their courts into centres of faith and learning. Each conversion was a story of its own, not of conquest, but of conversation. In Northumbria, a queen named Ethelbert brought her faith to her husband, King Edwin, just as Bertha had once done in Kent. When Edwin hesitated, wondering if the new god was stronger than the old, one of his wise men stood before him and spoke with quiet eloquence. "The life of man," he said, "is like the flight of a sparrow through a hall on a winter's night. From the darkness it comes, into the firelight it flies, then out into the dark again. If this new teaching tells us more of what lies before and after, it is well to hear it." And Edwin listened. He was baptized in the river, and with him, an entire people stepped into new belief. The monasteries that followed became the heart of the Saxon kingdoms. Built of timber and stone, they stood like islands of calm amid the wild countryside. Places where bells rang at dawn and dusk, where monks copied books by candlelight, preserving the wisdom of ages. The halls that once echoed with drinking songs now held quiet chant. The ink that once marked runes now shaped Latin words. Knowledge, long dimmed by war and isolation, began to glow again. From these early centres, Canterbury, Lindisfarne, Jarrow, came teachers, poets, and chroniclers. They recorded not only the scriptures, but also the history of their people. In their hands, the Saxons' oral world found written form, and memory gained permanence. Still, the transition was not without struggle. There were those who resisted, priests of the old faith, farmers who saw the new gods as strangers to their soil. Some clung to the old ways in secret, hiding their charms in the thatch or carving runes behind their doors. The monks did not always understand this, but over time, both faiths found a strange harmony in the landscape. A church might stand beside a sacred tree. A well once blessed for the goddess of spring might be renamed for a Christian saint. The island had a way of blending what it was given, of turning even difference into something whole. By the end of the 7th century, the cross stood tall across the land. The kings now ruled not only with the sword, but with the pen and the prayer. The Saxon world had become part of a greater story, one that reached across continents and centuries. Yet even as they embraced the new faith, the Saxons never forgot the old rhythms, the love of land, the sense of fate, the quiet reverence for the natural world. The monks themselves wrote of it with affection, of the mists that rolled over the fens, of the sound of rain on the cloister roof. of the way dawn broke over fields still whispering with ancient memory. In those writings, we can still feel it, the blend of two worlds, the gentle handover between gods. One evening, in the soft gold of sunset, Augustine is said to have stood outside his church at Canterbury, listening to the bell calling the faithful to prayer. He looked out toward the distant sea and smiled. The sound of the bell mingled with the cry of seabirds, the same that had once called across pagan shores. And perhaps, in that moment, he understood that the work was not to replace what was, but to transform it, to let old faith become the soil for new hope. The Saxons would keep that balance for centuries, their prayers half Christian, half earthbound, their hearts still listening to the wind, even as they turned toward heaven. The cross had come, not as a conqueror, but as a companion. And beneath it, the Saxon soul learned to dream anew. The centuries turned softly. The land that had once known only war now glowed with peace. Fields that had been trampled by armies shimmered again with ripening grain, and the wooden halls that once echoed with the clash of iron filled instead with music, laughter, and the low hum of prayers. This was the dawn of what poets would later call Mercia's golden years, a season of calm between storms, when the Saxon world seemed, for a time, perfectly balanced between faith and earth, courage and peace. Across the island, the 7 kingdoms breathed easier. Kent's ports hummed with trade. Wessex built new churches along its green valleys, and at the heart of them all stood Mercia, proud, fertile, wide as the horizon itself. Mercia, whose name meant the borderland, now ruled the heart of the island. It stretched from river to river, forest to forest, its people known for their craftsmanship, their music, and their gift for making beauty from simplicity. Under the long reign of King Offa, Mercia grew mighty. Offa was not a man of sudden rage or reckless conquest. He was deliberate, like a builder measuring his stones. He understood that to rule the Saxons was to hold a family of kingdoms, each proud, each ancient, each unwilling to bend. So he ruled with both sword and smile. When he fought hard. When he made peace, he made it generous. Under his hand, Mercia's fields grew rich and its people thrived. He minted coins of silver bearing his own name, one of the first English kings to do so, and his merchants traded with lands far beyond the sea. He even sent letters to Charlemagne, the great emperor of the Franks, as an equal, a boldness that few before him had dared. To the west, Offa built something remarkable, a line of earth stretching for nearly 200 miles along the Welsh border. Offa's Dyke, they called it. A boundary not of stone, but of earth and will, marking where Mercia ended and the mountains began. Even now, the long ridge still lies across the hills, green and quiet, like the faint scar of an ancient dream. But Offa's greatness was not in the wall he built. It was in the peace that followed. For the people of Mercia, life in those years flowed with a steady rhythm. At dawn, mists curled over the meadows. Farmers rose early, stepping barefoot into the dew, their breath white in the cool air. Oxen were yoked to ploughs, their slow strength carving the dark soil into neat furrows. The smell of earth and morning filled the air. In the villages, women spun wool, their wheels humming softly, while children fetched water from streams. The sound of hammers rang from the forges, smiths shaping iron for tools, jewellery, or the nails that would hold new churches together. At midday, when the sun stood high, The people gathered to eat barley bread, cheese, salted meat, and ale brewed in clay jars. In the shade of thatched roofs, they rested, speaking quietly of weather and harvest, of kin and kindness. Evenings belonged to the hearth. After the day's work, the family sat in a circle of light while the wind sighed through the trees outside. The old stories were told again, not of battles now, but of saints, of miracles, of the land's quiet blessings. A monk might pass through the village on his way between monasteries, carrying a satchel of books, his robe dusty from the road. He would be welcomed with food and warmth, for the monks were trusted as bringers of both wisdom and peace. The monasteries of Mercia were unlike anything the island had known before. Built of timber and stone, they rose beside rivers or beneath wooded hills, their walls simple but strong. Bells rang across the valleys, marking the hours with calm precision, morning prayers, midday psalms, evening song. Inside, rows of candles flickered over parchment and ink. The monks of Mercia wrote slowly, their quills moving with reverence. They copied not only the Gospels, but the old Saxon stories too, understanding that memory, sacred or worldly, was worth preserving. In the monastery of Lichfield, Offa established his own bishopric, ensuring that the voice of Mercia would echo in both crown and church. The scholars there wrote in both Latin and the blossoming English tongue, a language no longer merely spoken by farmers and warriors, but sung by poets and shaped by scribes. From these halls came the beginnings of English literature, the slow flowering of thought and beauty that would one day fill libraries. Faith and art walked hand in hand. The craftsmen of Mercia created works of astonishing grace. Brooches of gold and garnet, crosses of silver, and illuminated manuscripts that shimmered with blue and crimson. Their patterns wound in endless knots, a dance of line and colour that seemed to mirror both prayer and dream. The most famous of all lay buried for centuries beneath the soil of Sutton Hoo, a royal ship grave filled with treasures so fine that even kings of distant lands would have admired them. A helmet wrought in iron and silver, a sword with gold inlay, bowls and coins and ornaments beyond counting. To hold such things, even in imagination, is to feel the hum of a world both fierce and tender, a people who had once crossed the sea with little but courage, now shaping beauty from the bones of the earth. But what made Mercia's years golden was not its wealth alone. It was the peace of belonging. After generations of movement, of crossing and conquest, the Saxons had settled fully into their land. The fields they tilled were their own. The churches they built were made from their own timber. The songs they sang blended the old melodies of the Shorelands with the soft Latin hymns of the monks. In every home, the two worlds now lived side by side, the carved wooden cross beside the hearth, the runes still hidden on the lintel for luck. The Saxons had not forgotten where they came from. They had simply learned to carry it differently. Their faith had deepened, their hands had grown skillful, and their hearts, for a brief and precious span of time, were at ease. King Offa's reign lasted nearly 4 decades. When he died, the island mourned him as few kings were ever mourned. His power had held chaos at bay. His wisdom had turned ambition into order. But even golden seasons must fade. After Offa's death, the balance he had built began to tremble. The smaller kingdoms grew restless again. The kings of Wessex, to the south, began to dream of unity, not through peace, but through power. And beyond the seas, to the cold lands of the north, new eyes were turning toward England. eyes that glittered like the edge of steel. For now, though, Mercia still slept beneath the calm of summer. The fields were heavy with grain. The bells of Lichfield rang in the distance. Along Offa's dyke, the heather bloomed purple and soft, and shepherds watched their flocks beneath the slow-setting sun. In the halls, old men spoke of peace as if it were a birthright, unaware that soon the wind would shift and sails would rise on the horizon. But that belongs to another night. For this moment, in the hush between history's storms, the Saxons of Mercia lived in harmony with their land, their faith, and their dreams. Theirs was a world of steady hearts and quiet strength, a world that shone just long enough to remind the centuries that peace, too, can leave its mark upon the soul of a people. And somewhere, as the stars began to gather over the Midlands, a monk lifted his pen, dipped it in ink, and began to write. In the days of Offa, the land was good. The peace that had settled over the Saxon kingdoms did not end with thunder at first. It ended with whispers. Whispers carried on the salt wind, murmurs of sails seen in the east, of strangers moving like ghosts along the coast. Fishermen spoke of ships shaped like serpents, their prows carved into dragon heads that seemed to move when the light struck them. Monks along the Northumbrian shore began to hear the low beat of oars in the fog, the sound growing and fading like a distant heartbeat. At first, no one believed. England had known peace for so long that fear itself had grown thin. But one morning in the year 793, as dawn broke over the cold waters of the North Sea, that peace was torn apart. The first place to fall was Lindisfarne, a small island off the coast of Northumbria, a place of prayer and quiet, where monks had lived and worked for nearly a century. The island was sacred. Its monastery was known across Christendom as a beacon of light and learning. The brothers woke early that June morning, as they always did. Bells rang, soft and hollow, calling them to prayer. Mist clung to the rocks. The sea was calm. Then came the sound, the rhythmic slap of oars against water. The monks looked up and saw shapes moving through the fog. Long, narrow boats, their sails striped red and black, their figureheads gleaming wet in the dawn. By the time the alarm bell was struck, it was too late. The Northmen had landed. They came with axes and torches, shouting words the monks could not understand. Their hair was long, their eyes pale as the northern sky. They moved with a terrible grace, swift, efficient, like men born to the sea and the sword alike. The wooden doors of the monastery splintered beneath their blows, the air filled with smoke and cries. Books and relics, years of quiet devotion, were scattered and burned. The seabirds screamed as the raiders carried away gold, silver, and captives. Monks dragged to the ships, their white robes stained with ash. When the tide went out, the island lay silent again. Only the sound of waves remained. Lindisfarne had fallen, and the age of the Vikings, the Northmen, had begun. The news spread like fire through the kingdoms. From Wessex to Mercia, from Kent to the northern hills, people spoke in fear. The sea wolves have come. They called them Danes, though not all came from Denmark. Some were from Norway, others from Sweden, all bound by the same hunger for land, silver, and glory. At first, they came only to raid. Their longships appeared suddenly along the coast, swift as shadows, gone before an army could gather. They struck monasteries, for there the wealth was kept, crosses of gold, chalices of silver, manuscripts bound with precious stones. The Saxons, who had long forgotten the ways of war, were slow to answer. Many villages lay undefended, trusting still in peace and prayer. The monks wrote of the terror in their chronicles. Fierce heathen men, the pagans of the north, came with the tide and brought slaughter to the holy places. But the raids did not stop. Each year they returned, their fleets larger, their courage bolder. The Saxons had faced war before, but never like this. The Northmen were not bound to the land. Their home was the sea. Their ships could travel upriver, striking deep into the heart of the island where no enemy had ever come. Villages that had once known only the soft sound of church bells now heard the clash of iron and the crackle of fire. And yet there was more to them than fury. They were explorers, craftsmen, poets in their own right, men who believed in fate as the Saxons once had, who saw the world as a place of challenge and honour. To the terrified Saxon farmer, they were demons. To themselves, they were seekers of renown, fulfilling the will of their own gods, Odin, Thor, and Freya. The Saxons, now long Christian, saw in them a reflection of their own pagan past, fierce, proud, unyielding. It was as though the island was being forced to face the echo of what it had once been. Years turned, and the raids became settlements. The Northmen began to stay. They built winter camps along the rivers, small at first, then growing into towns: York, Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, Leicester. These would later form the spine of what came to be called the Danelaw, the lands ruled by Danish law and custom. In the beginning, they fought the Saxons for every field, every hill. But over time, peace, uneasy though it was, began to grow again. Traders and warriors became neighbours. The Norse tongue mingled with Old English, shaping words still spoken today. There were marriages, treaties, shared feasts. The Northmen brought their skills, shipbuilding, metalwork, lawmaking, and their sagas of courage and fate. But the cost of peace was high. Many Saxon monasteries lay in ruins. Libraries burned, the golden crosses of Mercia were gone, melted down into coins. Even so, the Saxons did not lose their faith. They only learned to hide it deeper, beneath the soil and in the heart. In the south, a young kingdom began to rise in defiance. Wessex, small and steady, held its ground where others faltered. Its kings watched the northern fires and swore that they would not bow. Among them was a child who would one day become a legend, a boy named Alfred, whose name would echo through time. But for now, he was still only a prince, growing up in a world where safety was vanishing like mist at sunrise. Everywhere, the Saxons learned to live with watchfulness. They built burhs, fortified towns with strong wooden walls and towers. Villagers trained with spears. Messengers rode from shire to shire, warning of sails on the horizon. The rhythm of life changed. The sound of church bells now mixed with the clang of forge and shield. Still, the people endured. They always had. For those who lived through those years, the memory of peace seemed like a dream half remembered. But there were moments, even amid fear, that still glowed with the warmth of the old days. On quiet nights, when the sea was calm and no sails marked the horizon, the villagers still gathered by the fire. The storytellers spoke softly, not only of saints and miracles now, but of courage and loss, of men who stood against the storm. Children listened, wide-eyed, as their parents told of the Northmen, not as monsters, but as part of the great turning of fate. Every tide must rise, they would say, and every tide must fall. And in that saying was both sorrow and hope. The monks who survived Lindisfarne fled south, carrying what relics they could save. They wandered for years before finding a new home inland, far from the sea's reach. There, in quiet valleys, they rebuilt their libraries, copying once more the words that had been lost. They wrote of their suffering with gentleness, not vengeance, believing that even in disaster, the hand of providence could still be seen. "We were tested," one monk wrote, "as gold is tested by fire." The Saxons, tempered by that same fire, grew strong again. The Northmen had come with steel, but they would not find an easy conquest. The island, though wounded, would rise. For every hall they burned, another would be rebuilt. For every monk slain, a new voice would rise in prayer. And from this long, dark struggle, something new would be born, not just survival, but unity. The wind shifts now, colder, sharper. Imagine standing on a cliff above the North Sea, the air heavy with salt, the horizon glowing faintly red. Far below, the waves roll endlessly, whispering of those who came before. The Saxons, the Britons, the Northmen. Their fires have long gone out, yet their echoes remain. In the place names, in the words we speak, in the very spirit of endurance that still lives in the land. The Northmen arrived like storm and flame, but in time, even their fury would give way to new peace, and from that peace would rise a man, a scholar, a warrior, a king, who would take the broken pieces of England and make them whole again. But for now, the night belongs to the sea. The waves move, tireless and ancient, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the sound of oars still fades into the mist, steady, distant, eternal. The storm that broke upon England did not pass quickly. Years rolled like restless tides, one invasion after another, one burning after another. The Vikings had not only come to raid, they came to stay. Across the north and east, the Danelaw tightened its grip. Towns once Saxon now spoke Norse. Fields were ploughed by foreign hands, and yet in the south, one kingdom still held its ground, Wessex, the last hope of a fading world. At its heart was a young man who did not look like a conqueror. He was quiet, thoughtful, his hands more suited to a book than a sword. But destiny, as it often does, cares little for a man's nature. His name was Alfred, and before the world was done with him, they would call him the Great. Alfred was born in the year 849 in the royal town of Wantage. He was the youngest of 5 brothers, the least likely to inherit a crown, yet the one who would one day carry the weight of all England upon his shoulders. From childhood, he was drawn not to war, but to words. His mother, Osba, once showed him a book of Saxon poetry, its pages illuminated with bright colours and gold. She promised it to whichever of her sons could learn to read it first. Alfred, still a boy, listened to the verses as she read them aloud, the rhythm, the beauty, the echo of ancient voices, and quietly he vowed that one day those words would be his own. He learned not only to read, but to listen, a rarer gift. He listened to stories, to counsel, to the land itself. And perhaps that is why, when his time came, he would prove not just a warrior, but a builder of souls. When Alfred was young, England was already divided. The north had fallen under Viking rule. Mercia had been broken. East Anglia lay in ashes. Only Wessex still stood free, its kings, Alfred's brothers, fighting constantly to keep the invaders at bay. Alfred fought beside them, earning scars and silence. He saw battlefields strewn with the remnants of faith and fear alike. He saw churches burned, villages emptied, families scattered. Yet through all of it, he carried something unbroken, a sense that the land itself could heal, that the Saxon spirit could endure. When at last his brothers were gone, Alfred became king. He was still young, and the crown weighed heavy upon him. The Danes pressed south, their warlords demanding tribute, their ships crowding the rivers. Alfred paid them gold when he could, fought when he must, and prayed always for wisdom. But wisdom alone cannot stop fire. In the dark winter of 878, the storm reached him. A great Viking army led by Guthrum, a warlord of the Danelaw, swept through Wessex, taking town after town. Alfred's forces were scattered. His hall at Chippenham fell to the enemy in a single night. He fled into the marshes, hunted, homeless, king of nothing but reeds and fog. The land there was wild, waterlogged and cold. The Isle of Athelney, a hidden refuge between rivers. There, Alfred built a small camp with a handful of loyal men. Food was scarce, hope scarcer still. The people whispered that England was finished, that the gods, old and new alike, had abandoned them. But in that silence, in the still heart of despair, Alfred began to dream. They tell a story, half legend, half truth, of a day in those marshes when a weary Alfred took shelter in the hut of a poor woman who did not recognize him. She gave him a few cakes to tend over the fire while she worked. Lost in thought, the king let them burn. When the woman returned and saw the blackened bread, she scolded him soundly, not knowing she was speaking to her king. Alfred said nothing, only bowed his head and accepted her anger. In that moment, the scholar king learned humility in the humblest of places, a lesson that would serve him better than any sword. For while others saw only ashes, Alfred was already thinking of how to rebuild. From the marshes, he sent messengers quietly through the land, to every loyal ealdorman, every soldier still willing to fight. "Meet me at Egbert's stone," he told them. "The time has come." And they came. Farmers, monks, outlaws, men who had lost everything but courage. They gathered in the spring mists, carrying rough weapons, their eyes bright with a hope they had not dared to feel in months. When Alfred rode among them, he spoke not of vengeance, but of purpose. "This land is not ours to surrender," he said softly. "It is our children's. We will fight not for glory, but for home." And so, with that quiet fire, they marched. The armies met at Eddington, near the edge of the Wiltshire hills. The battle was fierce, but short. Alfred's men, hardened by loss, fought with the strength of those who have nothing left to lose. The Danes, weary from years of raiding, faltered beneath their charge. When the dust settled, the unthinkable had happened. The Saxons had won. Guthrum, the Viking warlord, fled, but soon surrendered. Alfred did not have him killed. Instead, he offered peace. He baptized Guthrum into the Christian faith, naming him godson and swearing him to an oath of friendship. The two men, once enemies, stood side by side as water touched Guthrum's brow. In that simple act, Alfred changed the course of history. It was not only a truce, it was transformation. After Eddington, England began to heal. Alfred rebuilt the fortresses of Wessex, turning them into strongholds, burhs, linked by roads so that help could travel swiftly. He organised his army, creating a system of rotation so that half the men could fight while the other half farmed. He reformed laws, insisting that justice should serve both king and commoner. He welcomed scholars from distant lands, determined that learning would never again be lost to war. In his halls, the air once filled with fear now echoed with voices reading aloud, Latin texts, Saxon poems, prayers. Alfred himself translated books into English so that even common folk might learn wisdom. For without learning, he wrote, we are like trees without roots. He dreamed not only of defence, but of renewal, a land where faith and reason, courage and kindness could live side by side. The years passed, and peace slowly took shape. The Vikings who remained began to trade, to farm, even to intermarry with the Saxons. The borders between Danelaw and Wessex blurred. England, though divided, was beginning to think as one. The monks wrote of Alfred with quiet awe. He was a man who never despaired, one said. He built hope from ruins. And yet Alfred never saw himself as a conqueror. He was, above all, a caretaker of people, of learning, of the fragile flame of unity that might one day burn bright enough to call itself a nation. He once said to his scribes, "We will never be strong through power alone. We will be strong when every man knows his worth, before God and before each other." In those words lies the heart of his dream, an England not merely defended, but defined. In the last years of his reign, Alfred often walked alone along the rivers of Wessex. He would pause to listen to the wind in the reeds, the same sound that had once carried his despair in Athelney. Now it was gentler, a song of peace, of promise kept. He died in 899, his kingdom safe, his people learning once more to build rather than to burn. But his dream did not die with him. It lingered, in the schools he founded, in the walls he built, in the courage he had kindled in every heart that still called itself Saxon. And from that dream, in generations yet to come, England itself would rise. The fires of the Northmen had tested the Saxons as no enemy ever had. And from that trial came strength, the kind that cannot be taken by sword or flame. The scholar king, the exile in the marshes, had done what none before him could. He had turned survival into unity and fear into faith. Even now, if you stand by the rivers of Wessex at dusk, when the wind moves through the reeds, you might almost hear it, the whisper of his dream still breathing through the land. Soft, steady, unbroken, the dream of Alfred, the dream of England. The land was quiet again. Smoke no longer rose from the hills, and the sound of swords was replaced by the hum of daily life, the steady rhythm of plough and prayer. In the years that followed Alfred's victory, a strange and beautiful thing happened across Wessex and the wider island. The people who had once lived by battle and blood began to build with words instead. It was as if the very soul of the Saxons, hardened by war, tempered by loss, had turned inward, seeking not conquest now, but understanding. And in that silence after chaos, learning returned. King Alfred had always believed that knowledge was the truest defence of a people. "A kingdom without wisdom," he had written, "is a body without sinew." So, while others built walls, Alfred built schools. He gathered scholars from across the seas, from Mercia, from Gaul, even from Ireland, men of letters and faith who could teach the art of reading, writing, and translation. Together, they created something England had never known before, a network of learning that reached from the royal court to the smallest village. In his royal hall at Winchester, Alfred established what he called a school of the court. There, the sons of nobles and priests studied scripture, philosophy, and law. The king himself joined their lessons, sitting among them not as ruler but as fellow student. They read not only the holy texts, but also the wisdom of earlier ages, the writings of Boethius, the histories of Bede, the meditations of Augustine. And for the first time, these words, once locked in Latin, were rendered into English, so that every man, even those who worked the soil, might share in their light. This was Alfred's great vision, to give learning a home in the language of his people. He commissioned translations himself, taking quill in hand, his own words soft and measured. One of his scribes wrote, "The king read slowly but with great care that all might understand." In his preface to Pastoral Care, Alfred wrote, "I desired to live worthily while I lived, and after my life to leave to those who come after, memory of me in good works." And he did. From his pen, and those of his companions, came the first flowering of English prose, a language born not of scholars, but of the earth, rich with rhythm and warmth. It was a language the common people could hear and understand, words that spoke of home, of duty, of faith. This was the beginning of something larger than even Alfred could have known, the shaping of English identity through the power of language. Alongside learning came law, not as tyranny, but as harmony. Before Alfred, justice had been a patchwork of customs, different in every shire, every village. A man's worth, his rights, his very safety could depend upon where he was born. But Alfred sought order that would bind the land as his words had bound its speech. He gathered the old codes, those of earlier kings like Anne of Wessex, and blended them with Christian principles. From this, he created what became known as the Doom Book, a collection of laws both sacred and practical. It began not with punishment, but with peace. First, it said, we must love one another. His laws spoke of fairness, of mercy, of proportion. They protected widows and orphans, punished theft, but allowed redemption, and insisted that every judgment be given without hatred or haste. Where once vengeance had ruled, Alfred planted justice. He understood that a kingdom built only on power would crumble, but one built on law could endure long after the sword was laid down. In those years, the villages of Wessex began to flourish again. The burghs Alfred had built for war now became centres of trade and craft. Markets returned, roads filled with carts carrying wool, honey and salt. Blacksmiths and weavers worked by firelight, their craft a language all its own. The churches grew busier, their bells calling the faithful not in fear, but in gratitude. Monks rebuilt what the Northmen had burned, their quills once more scratching across parchment in patient rhythm. In every corner of the land, a quiet revival was taking root. The Saxons, who had long been seen as warriors and wanderers, were becoming something else, a people of memory and mind. To step into a monastery of that age was to enter a world between worlds. The air smelled of wax and vellum. Candles flickered along wooden shelves filled with scrolls and books bound in leather. The monks moved in silence, their sandals whispering on stone floors. Each morning began with prayer, followed by work, copying texts, illuminating pages with gold leaf and lapis blue. To write a single book might take years, but to them, time was not the measure of worth. They believed that every word written was a prayer made visible. Some manuscripts from that era still survive, their letters delicate and dark, their margins filled with vines, birds, and interwoven knots. They are the art of patience itself. The monks of Glastonbury, Canterbury, and Abingdon became keepers of a new world, one where ink, not iron, held power. And yet, beyond the cloisters, life was never only quiet. The Saxons remained a people close to the soil, their days shaped by the turning of seasons. Farmers still read the sky as they once had read omens. Shepherds still sang to their flocks beneath the same stars that had guided their ancestors. But their world now had structure, a rhythm of law and learning that brought stability to their toil. Children born in Alfred's peace grew up never knowing the terror of invasion. To them, England was not a dream to be defended, but a home already made. They learned their prayers in English. They heard the scriptures read aloud in their own tongue, simple words that spoke directly to the heart. It was the first time in the island's long history that a whole people could truly share a language, not only of speech, but of belonging. In the generations after Alfred, his dream became a tapestry woven tighter still. His son Edward the Elder and daughter Ethelfled, the Lady of Mercia, carried on his work. Together they strengthened the burghs, reclaimed lost lands, and expanded learning. Ethelfled, in particular, was a marvel of her age, a queen who led armies, founded churches, and ruled with the same wisdom her father had cherished. Her people called her simply the Lady, for she governed not through fear, but through quiet strength. Under their rule, the island began to look like one nation. The borders between the old kingdoms blurred. The idea of Engleland, the land of the Angles and Saxons, was no longer only a dream. Everywhere, the echoes of Alfred's reforms could be felt. In the courts, justice was spoken in English, not Latin. In the fields, trade thrived under consistent law. In the halls, poets once again sang, their verses no longer laments for loss, but hymns to endurance. The old songs blended with the new, just as faith had once blended with the land. Even the stories of the Vikings softened over time. The sons of the Northmen became farmers, their words mingling with the Saxons, until no one could tell them apart. The sea, which had once brought fire and fear, now carried traders and travellers again. It was as though the whole island had exhaled, a deep collective sigh of relief after centuries of holding its breath. And in that breath, England found itself, not the England of empire or conquest, but the England of craft and care, of words carefully chosen, of justice carefully measured, of faith made gentle by experience. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. And though darker tides would come again, new invasions, new trials, the foundation laid in Alfred's time would hold. His schools, his laws, his books would outlive the storms. For while kingdoms rise and fall, the written word endures. On certain nights in Winchester, when the wind moves through the narrow streets and the bells ring softly from the old cathedral, you can almost imagine the ghost of Alfred walking there, a quiet figure, hands clasped behind his back, listening. He would hear not the clamour of battle now, but the whisper of pages turning in candlelight, the laughter of children learning their letters, the murmur of justice spoken in fair tones. He would smile, perhaps, and know that his dream had not been forgotten. For from his vision, the belief that wisdom could heal a wounded land, a new kind of kingdom had been born. Not of swords, but of stories. And its legacy would last far beyond his reign, woven like golden thread through the centuries that followed, a tapestry of learning and law, shining still beneath the long English sky. The dream that Alfred had kindled, fragile, golden, born in the marshes of despair, did not fade with his passing. It passed like fire from candle to candle, carried by his children, his grandchildren, and the quiet faith of a people who had finally learned that peace was worth defending as fiercely as any crown. In the years that followed, the name Wessex came to mean more than a kingdom. It meant endurance, the steady heart at the centre of the island, beating through wind and war alike. While other lands still bore the scars of Viking rule, Wessex thrived. Its villages hummed with work, its churches filled with song. The sons of Alfred had inherited more than land. They had inherited his vision, a dream not of power, but of unity. And from that dream, slowly, England began to take shape. After Alfred's death, his eldest son, Edward the Elder, took the throne. He was not the scholar his father had been, but he was no less wise. His hands were those of a builder, his heart steadfast. Edward understood that the peace Alfred had won could not last unless it was protected by strength. So he strengthened the burhs his father had built, raising their walls higher, linking them by roads and beacons. If danger came again, the people could gather behind those defences, villages becoming fortresses, fortresses becoming towns. With his sister Ethelfled, the Lady of Mercia, Edward began to push the borders outward. Together, brother and sister reclaimed what had been lost to the Danelaw. Town by town, river by river, they brought the Saxon lands under one banner once more. It was not a war of conquest, but of restoration, the gathering of scattered kin. Ethelfled, ruling Mercia after her husband's death, was unlike any woman of her age. She rode at the head of armies, built fortresses along the borders, and negotiated peace with the same calm strength her father had shown. The people called her Lady of the Mercians with reverence, for she led them not by fear, but by grace. When she died, her brother mourned her deeply. She was England's heart, he said, and perhaps in that moment, the word England was spoken not just as an idea, but as a living truth. Edward's children carried the work forward. His son, Ethelstan, Alfred's grandson, would become the first to truly call himself King of all England. Ethelstan's reign was one of vision and quiet brilliance. He had grown up surrounded by scholars and priests, trained in both arms and letters. When he came to power, he did not rest upon his inheritance. He expanded it. He united the kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia fully, bringing Northumbria under his rule after long struggle. For the first time, the whole of the island, from the southern shores to the northern hills, was bound under a single crown. It had taken 3 generations, a century of faith and fortitude, to reach that moment. Under Ethelstan, England stood whole. His court at Winchester was said to shine with learning and song. Scholars came from across Europe to teach and study there. The king himself loved books, as his grandfather had, and filled his halls with men of thought as well as of war. He issued laws that strengthened justice, protected the poor, and set down codes of conduct for merchants and craftsmen. He saw that a kingdom, to endure, must be governed not only by power, but by fairness. But Ethelstan was also a warrior. He defended his borders against Scots and Norse alike, his armies marching north through mountain and mist. His victory at Brunanburh in 937 became the stuff of legend, a battle where Saxon, Mercian and Dane fought side by side for a single cause, to keep their land whole. The old poem that celebrated it still echoes through time. Never yet greater slaughter on this island. Never such terror before as they tell us of, since from the east came the Angles and Saxons. It was more than a victory. It was a declaration that England had finally come of age. In the years that followed, the House of Wessex became the spine of this new nation. Kings came and went, Edmund, Edred, Edgar the Peaceful, each building upon what the last had made. Though their tempers differed, though wars still flickered at the edges, the vision remained. One land, one law, one language. Under Edgar, the church flourished again. Monasteries rebuilt by Alfred's hand now became centres of art and song. Bells rang from new towers, monks tended vineyards and orchards, and for the first time, a king's coronation was marked by a ceremony that would echo through every English crowning for 1,000 years. The idea of kingship itself had changed. No longer just a warlord's right, it was now a sacred duty, an anointing before God, a promise of protection and peace. The Saxons, once divided by clan and border, were learning to see themselves as one people, not Kentish or Mercian, not Angle or Dane, but Inglis. And yet, even as unity grew, memory endured. The people still told the old stories beside the fire, of Alfred in the marshes, of the Lady Ethelfled riding in armour, of the kings who had turned the tide. But the songs had changed in tone. They were no longer laments for loss, but hymns of gratitude, of survival, of the strange and patient courage that had carried them through. England was not yet safe forever. The Northmen still watched the coast. New powers would rise. But for now, there was peace. The kind of peace built by generations who knew its worth. On long summer evenings, the light lingered over the fields of Wessex, painting the hills in gold. From the high towers of Winchester, the bells of the cathedral drifted across the valleys, the same bells that had once called monks to prayer, now calling a whole people to belonging. In the villages, children learned their letters in English. In the markets, merchants weighed their goods by common measure. On the roads, travellers spoke freely from one shire to another, their accents different, but their words the same. And in that sameness, the miracle of unity quietly lived. The House of Wessex had risen not by conquest, but by continuity, by the patient work of minds and hearts. From Alfred's book-filled hall to Ethelstan's crown, from the marshes of Athelney to the plains of Brunanburh, the Saxons had journeyed not just through war, but through wisdom. They had built a kingdom from faith, a nation from memory, and an identity from language, the soft strength of words that could hold a people together. Their kings would falter, their peace would one day be broken, but their foundation was unshakable, for it was laid not in stone, but in spirit. And as night fell across the fields of Wessex, the stars above shone in their quiet witness, the same stars that had guided Alfred's dream, now watching over the first true England, whole at last. The peace that had spread across England under the kings of Wessex was long and luminous, but even golden seasons fade. For a time, it seemed as if Alfred's dream had truly come to rest, that the island, once divided by fear and fire, had finally learned to breathe as one. The bells of Winchester rang clear across the valleys. Monks copied their books in calm. The fields, long scarred by war, grew rich again beneath the slow-turning sun. But far beyond the northern seas, the winds were stirring once more. In the cold halls of Denmark and Norway, a new generation of sea kings was rising. men who remembered that the island to the west was fertile, wealthy, and newly whole. They saw its calm as opportunity, its unity as challenge. And so the sails returned. Not the scattered fleets of old, but great armies, disciplined, determined, and bound not only by greed, but by ambition. The shadows of the north had come again. It began quietly, as all storms do. In the late 10th century, small raids appeared along the coast, villages plundered, monasteries burned. The people had grown used to peace. Their defences had grown soft. At first, the kings of England, descendants of Alfred and Ethelstan, dismissed the attacks as echoes of an older age. A few ships, a few losses, nothing more. But soon, the scale changed. Fleets of longships began to fill the horizon once again. The Northmen had learned from the past. They no longer came only for plunder, but for power, and among them rose a name that would soon strike fear and awe alike: Svein Forkbeard, King of Denmark, and his son Snut. The English king at that time was Ethelred, remembered by history with an epithet both cruel and sorrowful: Ethelred the Unready. The name did not mean foolish, as it later came to suggest, but ill-advised. A ruler surrounded by counsel that failed him when he needed it most. Ethelred was not without courage, but he was weary and uncertain. The unity his forefathers had built was beginning to fray beneath the strain of endless raids and heavy tribute. Desperate to buy peace, Ethelred began paying the invaders vast sums of silver. Danegeld, it was called, money meant to persuade the Northmen to leave. But peace purchased is peace postponed. Each payment only invited more ships, more fire, more demands. The people began to whisper that the king's silver was cursed, that for every coin offered, another storm rose across the sea. In those years, England trembled. From the northern coasts of Northumbria to the estuaries of the Thames, the longships came again. Their dragon heads gleamed in the mist. Their oars beat the rhythm of fate. But this new invasion was different. Many of the Danes who arrived now had kin already settled in England. Farmers, craftsmen, even lords. The line between enemy and neighbour blurred. Some joined the invaders. Others stayed loyal to their Saxon kings. The land itself seemed divided, a place of mingled blood and memory, unsure which song to sing. And in that confusion, the old fears returned. Ethelred's reign grew heavy with mistrust. His nobles quarrelled. His armies failed to unite. In a moment of desperation and grief, he ordered an act that would forever darken his name: the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002, in which Danes living in England were slain by royal command. The slaughter did not bring safety, it brought vengeance. Among those killed was, it was said, the sister of Svein Forkbeard. And when word reached the north, Sweyn's anger became fire upon the wind. He swore not only to raid England, but to claim it. The years that followed were a storm without rest. The Northmen came in waves, landing wherever the tide allowed. Towns that had known peace for a century now burned again. The Saxon people, who had once stood firm under Alfred and his heirs, felt the ground shifting beneath them. And then, in 1013, Sweyn succeeded where so many before him had failed. He conquered England outright. Ethelred fled across the sea to Normandy, taking his sons with him. For a few brief months, the island bowed to the north. But Sweyn's triumph was short-lived. He died suddenly the next year, leaving his young son Cnut, barely 20, to inherit both his father's crown and his impossible dream, to rule two worlds, Denmark and England, as one. Knut began not as conqueror, but as survivor. When Ethelred returned from exile to reclaim his throne, the Danes were driven north. Battles raged once more, old wounds reopened. And when Ethelred died soon after, his son Edmund Ironside rose to meet Knut in one final struggle for the island's soul. They fought across rivers and fields. The young Saxon king and the Danish prince, their armies evenly matched, their courage equal. At last, they met near Deerhurst, on the banks of the Severn. There, beneath the low clouds, the two men agreed to peace, dividing the realm between them. But fate would not allow two kings for long. That same year, in 1016, Edmund died, and Knut became ruler of all England. Many feared what his rule would bring, the harshness of a foreign conqueror, the old gods returning in triumph. But Knut was wiser than that. He had grown up among warriors, but he had learned from kings. He kept the laws of Alfred and his heirs, honoured the church, and married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, to bind old enemies in blood. He even prayed in the English tongue, standing beside monks whose brothers his forefathers had slain. Under Knut, England found for a time a strange new peace, a peace shaped by both Saxon and Dane. He ruled not as destroyer, but as bridge builder. His court was filled with both English lords and Norse jarls. His silver restored the monasteries, his decrees protected the poor. It was said that when he knelt before the cross, he wept openly, a sea king humbled by faith. The monks who once cursed the Northmen now wrote of Knut with awe. He was a king both mighty and merciful, a ruler whose heart was greater than his crown. Even the famous story of Knut and the sea, how he placed his throne upon the shore and commanded the tide to stop, speaks not of arrogance, but of humility. When the waves, of course, ignored him and washed over his feet, Knut turned to his courtiers and said, "Let all men know how empty is the power of kings. For none may command the sea, but he who made it." The Northmen had learned what the Saxons had always known, that true strength lies not in conquest, but in wisdom. For 20 years, Knut ruled England well. The realm he governed was vast, stretching from the fjords of Norway to the fields of Wessex. Trade flourished, churches thrived, and peace returned once more. But peace built on two tides cannot last forever. When Knut died in 1035, his sons quarrelled over succession, and the delicate balance unravelled again. The House of Wessex, waiting quietly in exile across the sea, began to stir once more. The shadows of the north were receding, and the old Saxon line was preparing to return, one final time, to reclaim the crown their ancestors had forged. For now, though, the land slept beneath a calm unlike any before. A calm born not of innocence, but of endurance. In the meadows, the wind whispered in two tongues, the old Saxon and the Norse. In the churches, prayers were said for both fallen raiders and fallen kings. The island had endured another turning of the wheel, another lesson in the long rhythm of rise and fall. And somewhere, perhaps on a quiet shore in Wessex, an old monk might have smiled, dipping his quill in ink, writing the same truth that echoed through every age of England's story. Peace is never born of conquest. It is born of remembrance. The sea had calmed again. The longships no longer haunted the coasts, and the sky above England seemed for a time mercifully clear. But peace in those days was like a fragile glass, beautiful, translucent, and always trembling in the wind. Nut's sons, who had inherited the vast empire of the north, soon turned against one another. Their quarrels broke the thread of unity their father had so carefully woven. And as they fought, the old Saxon blood, the line of Alfred and Ethelstan, patient and waiting, began to stir once more. From exile across the Channel, the House of Wessex prepared to return. When at last the moment came, it did not come with war. It came with quiet ceremony, with a welcome rather than a conquest. The year was 1042. Nut's sons were dead, and the nobles of England, weary of Danish rule, sent word across the sea to Normandy. Come home. And so he did. A slender, pale, thoughtful man named Edward, known even in his youth for his gentleness of heart and his gaze that seemed always turned toward heaven. When he stepped ashore, the air was soft with spring. The people gathered to see him, murmuring his name. Edward the Confessor, the son of Ethelred, heir of Alfred's dream, and now, at last, king. Edward was unlike any ruler England had known. He was not a warrior. He had no thirst for conquest, no hunger for power. Those who met him spoke of his serenity, his fairness, and his strange, otherworldly calm. He dressed simply. He prayed often. He moved through his halls like a man half dreaming, one foot in the world, one already in eternity. To his court, he brought a breath of the continent, for he had spent much of his life in Normandy, speaking French as easily as English, and surrounding himself with Norman advisors and clergy. To some, this felt like renewal. To others, it felt like betrayal. The Saxon nobles, proud and earthy, mistrusted the quiet foreigners who whispered in the king's ear. They saw their old ways slipping, the rough humour of the halls replaced by careful manners, their oak-built world scented suddenly with incense and Latin. And yet, Edward was loved, not for his strength, but for his peace. He ruled with patience. He forgave quickly. Under his hand, England prospered again, not through conquest, but through calm. Edward's greatest act of faith would become his lasting legacy. In the fields west of London, near the bend of the River Thames, he built a grand abbey, a place of worship and rest for the ages to come. He called it Westminster, and its stones still stand today, cool and pale beneath the long English light. There, craftsmen from across the realm carved arches and towers, blending Saxon solidity with Norman grace. Bells rang from its high windows. Monks walked its cloisters in silence, and when at last it was finished, Edward dedicated it to St. Peter, not as a monument to himself, but as a gift to the God he had served so quietly all his life. The abbey became the heart of the kingdom, and, in time, the resting place of kings. But even as its walls rose toward heaven, the shadows of the future lengthened across the land. Edward had no son, no heir. The bloodline of Alfred the Great, unbroken for centuries, was reaching its end. And so, as the king grew older, whispers began to fill the halls, whispers of who might wear the crown when he was gone. Among those who watched was Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, tall, golden-haired, and steady of hand. He was not royal by birth, but by merit, and he had become the most powerful man in England. He was everything Edward was not, pragmatic, commanding, born for action. Where the king prayed, Harold planned. Where Edward forgave, Harold fortified. And though they were different, They respected one another. Two halves of a realm that still held. But across the sea in the Duchy of Normandy, another man was watching too. William, Duke of Normandy, Edward's distant cousin, bound by blood but driven by ambition, had once been promised, or so he claimed, that Edward would name him heir to the English throne. Edward's time in Normandy had left its mark. The Normans believed he owed them loyalty. To William, England was not a foreign land, but an inheritance deferred. And when he heard that Edward had fallen ill, and that Harold had been crowned king in his place, William's quiet patience turned to steel. He would come for what he believed was his. But for now, England still had Harold. When Edward died in 1066, he was buried in the abbey he had built, his face serene, his body wrapped in silk, his people mourning not just a ruler, but a saint. His death marked the end of the old Saxon line, yet his memory glowed like candlelight in the hearts of the people. And when Harold was crowned, they looked to him as the living guardian of that light, the man who might keep the peace Edward had so tenderly held. Harold's coronation took place within Westminster itself. The great bells rang, echoing through the stone vaults. Priests lifted their voices in Latin blessing. Outside, crowds gathered in the winter air, shouting, "God save King Harold!" The last time those words would ever be spoken for a Saxon king. For a moment, the kingdom stood strong. Harold ruled with steady hands and clear eyes. He was beloved by his soldiers, respected by his people. His earls pledged loyalty. His borders held firm. But destiny was moving faster now, its steps echoing across the sea. Far to the north, a fleet of Viking ships, led by Harald Hardrada, the fierce king of Norway, appeared along the coast, claiming England once more for the north. At the same time, across the Channel, William of Normandy prepared his own invasion, building ships, forging alliances, waiting for the wind. Two storms were coming, one from the north, one from the south, and Harold stood alone between them. In September of that year, the northern storm struck first. Hardrada's fleet sailed up the Humber, their longships black against the dawn. They met Harold's army near Stamford Bridge on the green banks of the Derwent. The battle was fierce and sudden. The Vikings fought with the wild courage of their ancestors, the Saxons with the desperate strength of home. By sunset, the field was silent. Hardrada lay among his fallen men, and Harold Godwinson had won a victory worthy of legend. But the triumph brought no rest. Even as he tended his wounded, word came that William had landed at Pevensey, far to the south. The Normans had crossed. The second storm had begun. Harold marched his weary army back across the breadth of England. Through rain, through exhaustion, through the ache of fate itself. They met the Normans near the village of Hastings, on a ridge that overlooked the sea. The Saxons formed their shield wall, a line of oak and iron, hearts beating as one. They fought from morning until dusk, their banners snapping in the wind, their voices hoarse with battle cries. Harold stood at the centre, beneath the dragon standard of Wessex, unflinching. But as the sun dipped low, an arrow found its mark. The wall wavered, the line broke. When night fell, the field was quiet, and with that silence, the age of the Saxons ended. The house of Wessex, born in the mists of the 5th century, was gone. Its kings had crossed from Shorelands to empire, from pagan grove to Christian altar, from wooden hall to stone abbey. They had carved their story into the island's heart, not through conquest alone, but through endurance, wisdom, and faith. The Normans would now take their place. They would build castles, speak new tongues, bring new laws. But beneath it all, the Saxon soul would remain, quiet, patient, like roots beneath foreign soil, waiting for spring. In Westminster Abbey, Edward the Confessor still lay in peace, the candlelight flickering on his carved stone face. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of waves, the same sea that had brought his ancestors to Britain so many centuries before. The story had turned full circle. The ships had come again, but the spirit of the Saxons, though defeated, was not destroyed. It lived on, in the words, the customs, the fields, the songs. And even now, if you stand among the stones of Westminster as evening falls, you can almost feel it still. The hush before the bells, the memory of voices that once spoke softly in the Old English tongue, the breath of a kingdom that dreamed and did not wake. The morning of October 14th, 1066, broke grey and cool over the hills of Sussex. Mist clung to the fields, thick and low, muffling sound and softening shape. Beneath that veil of quiet, two armies waited, one weary and rooted in its homeland, the other fresh and foreign, staring toward its destiny. It was a Saturday, the feast day of Saint Calixtus. But the prayers said that morning were not for peace. They were for strength. The Saxons stood upon a ridge known later as Senlac Hill, a line of spearmen and housecarls, shoulder to shoulder, their shields locked together like the planks of a wooden wall. Behind them, the dragon banner of Wessex fluttered in the damp breeze. They had come far, marching south from Stamford Bridge, 200 miles in barely a fortnight. Their boots were worn, their arms heavy, yet their hearts were unbroken. They were defending not just a crown, but a way of life, the long rhythm of English soil, the steady peace their fathers had bled to build. At their centre stood King Harold Godwinson, England's last great Saxon king, his mail shining faintly in the morning light, his gaze fixed toward the mist below. And there, rising from that mist, came the sound. A low hum of horns, a ripple of drums, and then at last, the sight of banners. The Normans were coming. William, Duke of Normandy, rode at their head, his armour gleaming, his voice calm and commanding. Around him marched knights and archers, men from France, Brittany, Flanders, the finest warriors of their age. Their banners bore the cross, and their priests had blessed their swords. They came not as mere invaders, but as those who believed heaven itself had granted them this cause. William looked up at the ridge and saw the Saxon shield wall waiting, a living fortress of wood and will. He knew the hill would be hard to take, but he also knew what drove him: ambition, faith, and a promise made long ago. He raised his sword, and with a single shout, the Norman horns cried out across the valley. The Battle of Hastings had begun. The first assault came with arrows, a dark cloud loosed from Norman bows, arcing through the air like flocks of ravens. The shafts clattered harmlessly against the Saxon shields. The housecarls, veterans of many wars, stood firm, their axes ready. Then came the infantry, climbing the slope with steady pace, shouting prayers in French and Latin. The Saxons met them in silence until the last moment, when, with a roar that shook the hill, they struck. Axes fell like thunder. Spears shattered. The front lines clashed in chaos, iron against oak, faith against fury. The Normans broke first. The Saxons pushed them back down the slope, their cries echoing through the mist. For a brief shining moment, it seemed the old gods of England still walked beside them, but war is a patient deceiver. As the Normans fell back, a rumour spread through their ranks that William had been slain. Panic flickered. Men began to turn, retreating toward the sea. The Saxons, seeing their enemy falter, broke formation to pursue them, leaving the safety of their shield wall. It was then that William lifted his helmet high, revealing his face. "I live," he shouted, his voice carrying across the field. "I live, and with God's help, we shall yet win the day." Rallying his men, he wheeled his horse and charged back up the hill. The retreat had been a trap. Whether planned or seized by instinct, it worked. The Saxons who had chased too far were surrounded and cut down. The shield wall, broken in part, began to waver. The tide had turned. The battle raged for hours, fierce, stubborn, relentless. The sun broke through at midday, its light falling upon a sea of movement and noise. The Normans attacked again and again. Each time they climbed the hill, the Saxons drove them back. Each time they fell, William called them forward once more. Bodies carpeted the slope, Saxon and Norman together. The air stank of sweat, iron and earth, and still Harold held the line. As the day wore on, William changed his strategy. He ordered his archers to aim higher, their arrows loosed not straight, but skyward, to fall like rain. The Saxons, their shields raised to block the storm, looked upward, and in that moment their fate descended. An arrow struck Harold, piercing his eye. He fell where he stood, beneath the banner of Wessex. The cry went up that the king was dead. The shield wall, held together by his courage, began to crumble. The Normans surged forward one last time, sweeping up the hill with renewed ferocity. By sunset, the ridge was theirs, and the Saxon sun, that long, patient light that had risen over the island for 6 centuries, set at last. The field was quiet then. The dying lay among the fallen leaves. The dragon standard was trampled into the mud. Crows circled above, their calls echoing across the hills. William dismounted and knelt beside the body said to be Harold's. He did not gloat. He ordered that the king be buried with honour, though, in truth, none can say where Harold's bones rest. The Normans lit their torches and made camp upon the ridge. They sang hymns of thanksgiving. Below them, the dark sea whispered against the shore, as if mourning what had been lost. The next morning, the sun rose over a new world. The battle was done, but the conquest had only begun. William would soon be crowned in Westminster, the abbey built by the very man whose gentle reign had preceded this storm. The irony was not lost on those who watched, a Norman duke taking the throne beneath the arches of a Saxon saint. Yet history often moves in such circles. The conqueror kneels where the conquered once prayed. England would never be the same. The Normans brought new words, new laws, new stone. They built castles that pierced the sky and rewrote the language of power. But beneath the fresh mortar and Latin charters, the heart of the land remained Saxon. The fields, the songs, the stubborn kindness of the people. They endured as they always had. For though kingdoms change, the spirit of a people does not vanish. It sinks into the earth, the rivers, the language itself. It waits, quietly, until it is needed again. Centuries later, chroniclers would write of Hastings with awe and sorrow. Some saw it as tragedy, the death of an age of simplicity and courage. Others saw it as destiny, the forging of a stronger, more unified realm. But for those who had stood upon that hill, it was neither legend nor lesson. It was simply loss, the end of home as they had known it. When night fell that October day, the fires burned long upon the ridge. Somewhere in the soft wind, the old songs might still have been heard, faint, trembling, fading into the dark. The Saxon sun had set, but its light had not gone out. It lingered, in language, in custom, in quiet defiance. The conquerors would speak their French and build their towers, but over time, the land itself would teach them the rhythm of English speech, the gentleness of English reign. The Saxon dream lived on, not in crowns, but in the ordinary hearts of those who tilled the soil, rang the church bells, and whispered prayers in their own tongue long after the Norman priests had gone. And so, though Hastings ended an age, it also began another, one that would carry both peoples forward, their roots forever intertwined. When you walk the fields near Hastings today, the grass moves softly in the wind. The hill is still there, green and quiet, the air sweet with salt from the distant sea. No banners, no blood, no sound but the whisper of the past. Yet if you listen closely, you may still hear it. The murmur of men locking shields, the cry of a horn from the mist, and somewhere, beneath it all, the heartbeat of a people who stood until the very end. The last Saxon sun has set, but its glow still lives in every English dawn. The last Saxon king had fallen, the banners of Wessex lay torn upon the field, and yet, as the Normans raised their towers and wrote their laws, the land beneath them did not forget. History changes the crowns, but never the earth. The same rivers still flowed, the same forests still whispered, the same church bells, once Saxon, now Norman, still rang across the meadows at dawn. And in that continuity, the Saxons endured, not as rulers now, but as roots. For generations after Hastings, England was a realm divided not by blood, but by memory. The Normans ruled from their stone castles, their voices steeped in French. They spoke of fealty and lineage, of dukes and domains. But below, in the towns and villages, the people still spoke the old tongue. Softer now, shaped by time, but still Saxon at its heart. Their words became the seed of the English language as we know it. Simple, sturdy, filled with rhythm and clarity. Home, heart, hearth, friend, hope, all Saxon. The vocabulary of belonging, even as French words filtered in. Court, noble, honour, the Saxon words remained, grounding speech in earth and rain, in the quiet strength of everyday life. So while kings and nobles spoke of conquest, the people spoke of keeping. And in that keeping, the Saxons won a quieter kind of victory. The Normans built upward, towers, fortresses, cathedrals that reached toward heaven. The Saxons remained outward, fields, cottages, hedgerows that reached toward one another. Together over time, they formed something new, not two peoples, but one country. The Old English and the Norman French mingled in marriage and market alike. Their children grew up speaking both tongues, living both ways, the discipline of the castle and the patience of the plough. The island learned to balance, the sword and the pen, the noble and the humble, the prayer and the song. And beneath all that change, the Saxon spirit, steady, grounded, unhurried, continued to hum like the earth beneath spring rain. In the centuries that followed, the world moved quickly. Kings rose and fell, plagues swept through the towns, empires reached outward, but still, the rhythm of English life echoed the Saxon heart. In every parish church of stone, you can still see it. The rounded arch, the narrow window, the simplicity of line that speaks of a faith both practical and pure. In every market town, you can still hear it, the cadence of English speech, rolling like the hills, clipped yet musical, old as the soil itself. In every countryside, where cottages sit close beside winding lanes, the pattern of settlement, the names of fields, woods, and rivers still carry their ancient Saxon syllables. Hampton, meaning home farm. Tun, meaning enclosure. Ford, the shallow crossing of a stream. They remain on every map as though the land itself remembers the voices that first named it. For though their kings were gone, the Saxons had achieved something more enduring than any crown. They had given England its language, its faith, and its quiet way of being. The Saxon soul was never a loud one. It did not crave glory or shout its name into eternity. It preferred the steady, unbroken thread, the honest work, the simple prayer, the love of land and kin. And so, through all the storms that came after, the Crusades, the Reformations, the Wars of Roses and Crowns, that soul endured, invisible but unbroken, carried in the hearts of common folk. Imagine an evening 200 years after Hastings. A peasant stands outside his thatched house, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The bells ring from a distant church, Norman stone, Saxon faith. He cannot read the Latin prayers carved above the doorway, but he understands their meaning. He crosses himself, whispers a short blessing for his family, and turns back toward the hearth, where supper waits. In that small gesture, unremarked, unnoticed, the entire history of his people still lives. The faith Alfred cherished, the peace Offa sought, the endurance that carried them through invasion and fire, all of it survives in the rhythm of an ordinary life. Even the great cathedrals, with their French arches and Latin hymns, could not erase the Saxon gentleness that lingered beneath them. Listen closely within the echoing aisles of Canterbury or Winchester, and you may still sense it. The echo of older prayers whispered in English, long before the conquerors came. Their words are gone, but their warmth remains. The stones themselves seem to remember. Time carried England forward. The Normans became Englishmen, the Saxons became memory. But memory in England is never truly lost. It seeps into everything. When the first English poets wrote their lines, they wrote in a language half born of Saxon earth. When Shakespeare spoke of kings and storms and dreams, he used their words still. When the Bible was translated into English, it was their syntax, short, clear, human, that gave it grace. Even the way the English describe their weather, their homes, their hearts, all traces back to that older way of seeing, the belief that life is not to be conquered, but tended. 1,000 years have passed since Hastings, and yet, if you walk the countryside of southern England, you might still meet them. Not in flesh, but in feeling. In the farmer mending a stone wall as the light fades. In the child skipping along a churchyard path lined with yews. In the soft ring of a bell calling a village to evening prayer. The Saxons are still there. Not as ghosts, but as guardians of rhythm and patience, of the beauty found in ordinary endurance. In a way, the story of the Saxons was never about power. It was about belonging. They began as wanderers, tribes from the cold Germanic shore, drawn by the promise of an island across the mist. They became settlers, then kings, then memory. And yet, through all of it, their deepest gift to history was a sense of home, a belief that the world, though harsh, can be made gentle through care. That faith, though tested, can grow in any soil. That words, once spoken with honesty, can outlast empires. If you listen to modern English, the language of millions, spoken across oceans and continents, you are hearing their echo still. Every simple word, every sentence built on their bones, is a living monument to their endurance. The Saxons may have vanished from the throne, but they remain in the tongue that tells this very story. Their voices, woven into the speech of the world, have made them immortal. And so, our journey closes where it began, by the sea. The same grey waves that once carried their ships to this island still roll upon its shores. The gulls still cry. The wind still smells of salt and memory. Stand there for a moment at twilight when the tide is low. The air is cool, the sky a pale silver. You can almost see their silhouettes upon the horizon, longboats fading into mist, oars dipping in rhythm, the faint sound of song carried by the wind. They are not leaving now, but returning, not in body, but in spirit, returning home, to the land they made, to the language they shaped, to the story that will never end. The Saxon age has passed, but its heart still beats quietly beneath every English dawn. In the warmth of the hearth, in the turning of the seasons, in the whisper of words that have outlived 1,000 kings, you can still hear it. The echo of the Saxons, the first dream of England, the soul that endures. And now, as the night deepens and the story folds to rest, let the sea grow calm. Let the stars gather softly above the hills and sleep, knowing that every history, even one long ended, still lives quietly in the hearts that remember. Good night and peace upon the shore.